very good morning to everybody. We welcome you all at NIAS and hope you're enjoying the Bangalore weather. I would like to invite Professor Rajaram Nagappa, who is the program head of International Strategic and Security Studies program, for the welcome remarks.
Good morning to all of you. We have here a very distinguished audience here, and I take this opportunity to welcome this galaxy of gathering. Professor Ramurthy, our director, unfortunately could not be here today, and he has asked me specifically to invite each and every one of you, greet you, and come to NIAS for the two-day conference here. The topic of the seminar today, Asia-Pacific Power Dynamics, Strategic Implications and Options for India, obviously is a very, very important and current topic. There was a time when the general attitude of the Asian maritime countries was to keep the Indian Ocean out of the big power rivalries. I think remember the objections to the US opening its base in Diego Garcia. The political discourse over the decades has changed today, and the Asia-Pacific region, straddling from the East African coast to Australia, is of geostrategic interest. This area forms one of the busiest sea lanes of the world, has some choke points, and is a theater of expanding maritime trade, rich resources, and also maritime boundary disputes. A rising and assertive China, the US and its rebalancing strategy, a slightly resurgent Japan with its own, no longer the same defensive Japan which used to be there, the regional architecture underpinned by the centrality of ASEAN, and the growing salience of security threats form very important components of the study. The implications of these issues for India and possible roadmap, needless to say, are very topical and relevant. The International Strategic and Security Studies program here at NIAS has been seized of these and various other and our own faculty resources here are not extraordinarily rich to tackle all such issues. But we are very, very lucky that we have a very active adjunct faculty. 10 of our people who work as adjunct faculty here, not work, I say, who devote their time as adjunct faculty, they allow us to draw upon their rich experience and quite often take the lead in promoting issues for discussion and debate. And they, in fact, in some cases like this, they shape the agenda. This seminar is the brainchild of Admiral Vijay Shankar, who is our adjunct faculty. He mooted the idea sometime last July. We went through a lot of internal deliberations, produced some input material. I think my colleague Moil especially went out of the way to do a lot of research and bring in the inputs. We also had one level of a roundtable type of discussion where we sort of sharpened the topic totally, and the outcome is today's seminar. So the main aim of the seminar is to enhance understanding of the strategic environment in the Asia-Pacific, the changing power dynamics affecting the littorals, including India's strategic and security interests. And hopefully, at the end of it, we'll have a new strategic insight and forward-looking analysis that will enable India to strengthen its relationships with other parts as well as shape its own strategy. These small words, I'm very happy to welcome all of you again. I do hope you have a pleasant stay in Bangalore, and I wish you all a very set of today and tomorrow fruitful discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nagappa. We will now have Ambassador C.V. Ranganathan, who would be giving the keynote address. Ambassador Ranganathan joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1959 and has served in a number of distinguished positions as a diplomat. He has been the first Secretary, Embassy of India to Beijing in China, and the Commissioner of India to Hong Kong. He has also been Ambassador of India to various countries, including China and France. Though he retired from the IFS in 1993, he continues to be active, hold advisory and research positions. He's the co-chairman of India-China Eminent Persons Group from 2006. His book, India and China, The Way Ahead, that was co-authored with V.C. Khanna, has won critical acclaim. He also served as the convener of the National Security Advisory Group. I now welcome Ambassador C.V. Ranganathan for the keynote address. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, all personal friends of mine for very long years. I am here under completely false pretext. Ambassador Shyam Saran should have been here, but in order to save the face of the Indian Foreign Service, I accepted this invitation with about less than 2 days' notice. Again, if I had known so many of my former distinguished colleagues were here, and I must say, Dr. Nagappa, all this vital information was kept from me, again, I may not have been here. But having said all this, I'm extremely happy to be here because we're dealing with a subject which is evolving, and it's going to be very difficult to predict, actually, how the future geopolitics of the Asia-Pacific region will actually work out. But certain trends are very clearly observable. And when we talk of Asia-Pacific, let us be far more broader looking than the narrow American definition of Indo-Pacific, which I'm sorry to say has greatly fascinated our own strategic experts. Actually, we should be thinking on a much wider canvas. And when you think of what is happening in West Asia, it is pregnant with negative features or impacts on us, beginning with what is happening in Syria, the rise of so many multiple jihadi groups who have their separate agendas, and what will happen? There's no political solution in sight. There seems to be a stalemate with Assad fighting with the militants, and the militants being supported by so many factors. You have the primeval Shia-Sunni conflict. You have an axis of Saudi Arabia and a few Gulf countries. You have the rise of Iran, which is recognized happily by the West, but you have the Saudi-Iran tension or conflict of interest, certainly. So, let us not underestimate the impact of all these things and how the future will pan out on India, particularly in what the Americans call the AFPAC region. Moving further to Central Asia, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, I think a very important feature which certainly has followed the economic rise of China is the attempt by China, and not necessarily opposed by others, of using its geographical position to build connectivities and thereby increase its economic, political, diplomatic, and other status in these countries. So in Central Asia, you do have a dominant Chinese presence with land and other links with vital countries which have resources like Kazakhstan and other countries. So you have a changing geopolitical contour spreading from Central Asia, not excluding South Asia, of course, and we could come to that when we discuss the problematic situation in this so-called AFPAC region. Here again, geography is being used to the advantage of a China which is economically dominant, and some would argue even militarily dominant, and so on. Therefore, and Southeast Asia, of course, which has been the traditional home. But there are other features of the current international geopolitical situation. Although the United States is dominant, both economically and militarily, and although there are some initial signs of U.S. recovery of its economy, the fact remains that the U.S. ability to try and lay down rules or lay down ways and means in which various current conflicts can be solved, its capacity to do this is highly diminished, and it's making awful bloomers. It works itself into positions from which it is so difficult to resile. For instance, the fact that Assad should step down, there should be a regime change there. The fact that democracy a la Western style should pervade Ukraine. And you do have a resurgence or a revival of a new type of Cold War, where you have the U.S. trying to dominate events in Eastern. And I'm sorry to say that U.S. is also supported by some Western European nations. And so you have this spectacle of the USA wanting to spread the American model perhaps, but certainly extend NATO and the European Union. Now, this is up against a very determined Putin, who is absolutely determined to keep Russia's sphere of influence, beginning, of course, with Crimea, but the future dispensation of Ukraine. And I personally sympathize with Putin for not wanting to discuss the new regime in Ukraine. These things, as we all know, have been sponsored by the West and contains inherent threats to Russia. So you have this additional feature. Now, if you go on from there, and I'm very conscious of the time, frankly, if I had read your concept note, which I have seen only now, again, I would have said that you've covered most things and suggested the principal points for discussion. Now, this brings me to China, and I, of course, recognize myself as the arch-China bore in the country. Now, when you look at China, it is very easy both to exaggerate its achievements as well as to underestimate its achievements. And normally, we have the exaggeration of the achievements. For instance, what one fails to recognize is that a vast country like China, with more than 1 billion population, with its boundaries all around, is always in a psychological state of insecurity, particularly with regard to its own domestic developments. China may have achieved the most remarkable prosperity in recent years, but it is not a happy country. And the Chinese leaders themselves are acutely aware of this, and various attempts will be made by the Chinese with great determination to restructure the old economic and social structures which have served China well enough into the early part of the 21st century, but it's full of defects and deficiencies. And therefore, this is one sort of transition, and I won't go, and you've got other very good experts there like Jayadev Ranade and others who can dwell more on the internal dynamics of China, which to my mind certainly makes it fragile, but certainly one cannot come to any early conclusions about China being weakened by these difficulties. They have the resolve, they have the leadership, and particularly talking of leadership, there's absolutely no doubt that although the Chinese have for some years had peaceful transitions of power, peaceful transitions of the leadership of the Standing Committee, peaceful nominations or stroke elections of who's to be the secretary of the party, the president of the country, and all the rest of it, the fact remains that under this collective leadership, shall I say, rubric, you do have a leader who has emerged, who has concentrated in himself various offices. And the difference between him and another very predominant leader, Deng Xiaoping, is that this is overtly he's in charge of several offices. I won't go into the details of these offices. But the differences between Deng Xiaoping, who held these offices rather covertly. The fact remains that you do have a leader now in China who has projected this famous dream of China, which is rejuvenation of China. Now, this expression really, in many ways, has great resonance with the Chinese. He is harking back both to the civilizational glories that China is famous for earlier, before the advent of colonialism, as well as the last 100 or so years or more of humiliation. That's one aspect of it. The second aspect of it is to try and restore confidence in the leadership of the Communist Party of China, which he would like to display as being very acutely sensitive about the social ills that prosperity has brought. Again, I don't have to list this. And thirdly, that there is a certain goal to achieve. Now, this in my mind, and this is a number of the problem as far as China's neighbors are concerned, contradicts many of various foreign policy objectives of China, or how China sees the world. Again, if you went through the documents adopted at the 18th Party Congress, including the huge report made by the previous outgoing secretary, you will find some of the most laudable and appreciable sentiments in about laying down China's foreign policy. I wouldn't like to go through this because the list is rather long, but the fact is that these sentiments, such as China's development should be, help neighbors' development, China does not want to do anything that will affect the interest of the neighbors. All this is there on the one hand. On the other hand, you do have very emphatic assertions followed by actions about China's core interests, which of course includes its rather expansive view of its territorial sovereignty, both overland as well as maritime. And of course, when you look at the latest budgetary figures, there is an accretion, an increase of 12.2% to its earlier budget, making it probably the amongst the top 2 or 3 on who spent on military defense. The problem is that when we look at China, we are exposed to so much of American literature on China, who are constantly comparing whatever China does with their own achievements and how China will affect American objectives, American standing, Americans' position in the international situation, etc., etc. But surely there's a whole world outside of purely American interests, and this is where we need to develop our own indigenous and autonomous outlook on China, and I must congratulate NIAS for having gatherings such as this, which is an attempt at doing that. Now, In the few minutes left before me, let me have a view of India-China relations. Having observed this relationship and been a small actor in it for a few years, I am absolutely surprised that with no other country in the world has India, I'm talking of the government of India, signed as many declarations, statements. With no other country has India had such frequent exchanges of high-level visits. With no other country are there such a density of bilateral dialogues. With no other country do you have such frequent meetings between leaders in multilateral fora, also bilaterally, particularly in the last few years, particularly beginning from this century, and so on and so forth. Now, this, I always argue with our own strategic thinkers who have a feeling that China does not attach importance to relations with India. The facts that I mentioned just now, or the occurrences or the events, will show that China attaches the greatest or great importance to relations with India. That is the first point. The second point that I'd like to mention is that the Chinese are acutely aware of the deep intersection of Indian and Chinese interests in certainly our part of the world, South Asia, but certainly extending to Central Asia and Southeast Asia. The other accepted wisdom which I differ from is that as far as Southeast Asian countries are concerned, they want India's presence or activity or activism in Southeast Asian forums to rebalance China. Professors Muni and others would recall that after 1988, when Rajiv Gandhi visited China, the first visit by a prime minister in 34 years, I happened to be there then. After that, the Southeast Asian countries, who always felt a little uncomfortable with the fact that India-China relations were strained or distant, were very happy to approach, to make overtures to India, which fortunately was particularly led by Singapore. What I'm trying to say is this was before our liberalization in 1991, and then, of course, the famous Look East and other things. And Southeast Asia, with its historical civilizational relations with India, certainly grabbed the first opportunity to get India. So what I'm trying to say is this came long before the economic growth of China, although it could have been visualized. So this is a fact that we should remember, and we should not really fall victim to this rebalancing theory. Having said this, I think the important thing to realize is that, as has been happening, India should reinforce its relations with each and every Southeast Asian country, and it is a matter of great gratification that Japan, even countries like Australia, who for long had given up on India because they thought we were irrevocably linked with the Soviet Union. Of course, that situation changed. So the point I wish to make is that as far as India is concerned, it is a matter of happiness, or it is a matter to be rejoiced, that India's own relations with each of the major powers, USA, European Union, Russia, China, Japan, have become far more stable than they've been before. The agenda of bilateral growth with each of these is expanding, and therefore I think it is vital for India that each compartment of our relations with the major powers are so implemented that it is not perceived by another major power to hurt its interest. This is a diplomatic challenge, but although the word itself or the phrase itself has come into, in my opinion, quite wrongly disfavor, this, in my view, is the essence of non-alignment. Now, how do we face the future, particularly in the context of what I said earlier about China using geography in very, very followed by its huge investments of linking up and connecting between each of her neighbors across borders, whether it's Central Asia, South Asia, Gwadar to Karakoram, railway to near Kodari, etc., etc. There is another way of looking at this, that with the rising maturity of India-China relations, is it impossible for us to avail of the same connectivities which are being established? Rather than be defensive, that here is another flouting of India's perception of its sovereignty over Kashmir and that part occupied by Pakistan, there is another way of looking at it. That if by some miracle, and only miracles can work here, we are able to have far more friendly relations with Pakistan, can this not also be utilized by India? And coming now to AFPAK region, I'm sorry, I might have crossed my time. Pakistan is making some hesitant first steps in trying to de-radicalize its society, which is in thrall by terrorists, and therefore those forces who stand for modernization, moderation, respect for plural society, eschewal of religious fundamentalism, particularly as it affects social institutions such as their law, legal system, etc., etc. So the question is, do you have sufficient of a mass, including the present government of Pakistan, who are doing their best to try and see that these forces win out? And these forces, I think, also feel that there should be better relations with India. And then you have Afghanistan and the post-2014 situation. I think the Afghans can be relied upon, and what one reads about is that very constructive steps are being taken to have a good election. I think the candidates are not unimpressive. So the question remains about whatever future government comes in Afghanistan, can they resist the threats from revived Taliban or existing Taliban or factional or tribal difficulties. Now, talking of Afghanistan, there have been intense dialogues between Indian and Chinese officials, including at the prime ministerial level. And in fact, the joint declarations and statements that I talked about, particularly if you look at the May 2013 joint statement when Li Keqiang came to India, there is a clear, I would say, commitment to work together to have a common security approach to South Asia. Of course, against terrorism, against this, against that, for this, for that. Or, I mean, as I said again, nothing could be more laudable. And at the same time, there's absolutely no doubt that there is a lack of trust on Chinese intentions, on the way China has grown, the way this thing, there's fear about its infrastructure development, about its economic achievements, etc., etc. I would submit that if China is to win the trust of the Indian public in its intentions, the test to my mind, is not the boundary question. The boundary question has been routinized. There are mechanisms to sort out difficulties. There has not been a single shot fired resulting in bloodshed, unless my information is wrong. So let us not talk about the boundary. Unfortunately, it will not be resolved till the Chinese revise their views on territorial sovereignty and integrity. And it applies to the maritime disputes in Southeast Asia, it applies to Japan, the maritime dispute in Japan, and certainly applies to our own territorial dispute, where, in my opinion, it can be solved in 5 minutes if the Chinese only resile from their absolutely rigid views on what constitutes China's sovereignty. So, it is not this problem which we are able to manage. It is this whole AFPAC region, how the Chinese view, how the Chinese are able to convince India about the quality of China-Pakistan relations. And this quality, Chinese interlocutors cannot claim in their own behavior to be such as to improve the quality of India-China relations. Let me give a few examples. The Chinese want the Kashmir and other disputes between India and Pakistan to be solved through bilateral dialogue. The Pakistanis scream loudly about Kashmir and UN. The Chinese want the line of control respected. The Pakistanis show scant respect for that, as we know. The Chinese would like India-Pakistan dialogue on various things to move ahead. The Chinese are against territorial, giving bases on its territory, which affects China itself, for terrorism. And the Chinese are very ambivalent about Pakistan's refusal to bring to justice those who are absolutely, against whom evidence exists. So what I'm trying to say is, when the Chinese keep telling us that, these are not at the cost of India-China relations, China's own behavior tilts things, including their total recognition of Pakistan's sovereignty over POK. Now, this is a sort of contradiction, and this is my main point, that the Chinese don't see as contradiction. They think that, in their own view, that contradictions are inevitable in international relations as even in personal relations. However, these contradictions somehow would be resolved through certain other broader circumstances, friendship, concessions, etc., etc. And this, I think, is one of the most difficult questions for all of China's neighbors. How do you live with Chinese contradictions? I think I've spoken too long. Since my own presence here is a little difficult, I think I'll just take 2 more minutes to try and focus on what I think that's part of the rubric of the seminar, Indian options. The most obvious commonsensical option for India is to have and for the world to perceive that India has a very stable government which is capable of being the motivator of economic and social development in India. I think the biggest contribution we can make to the India-China debate is at the political level, by improving our political culture and by improving our entire governance, which carries credibility not just to India but to the world at large. The second thing I've already mentioned is to maintain our relations with all the major powers in a stable way which will grow, but in a way that is not seen as ganging up against anybody else. Thirdly, it is absolutely imperative that while raising our capabilities in the defense field, we respond very positively to all our neighbors, including in Southeast Asia, could be West Asia, could be anywhere, Africa, who would like to participate in raising their own capabilities in the defense field. Fourthly, let us be absolutely confident that in keeping with the warm welcome given to India to participate in ASEAN affairs, there is equally strong welcome. There are people here who know this better than I do, to the active involvement of the Indian Navy, not just in the Indian Ocean, but in Southeast Asia, extending perhaps up to the Pacific. Another point, and I think this again is important, I think we should face China with far greater confidence at the strategic level than we seem to be doing now. There seems to be a rubbing off of the deep Indo-pessimism that we have about what is happening in India onto our foreign projection, onto our foreign policy field, and therefore diffidence about China. One could go on and on about not making the mistake of looking at China's economic development in a linear way. As it is, they themselves have quite reconciled to a lower rate of growth. But that's not the point. The point is, even with this lower rate of growth, unless there's a complete restructuring of their domestic economy, including the SCO's fiscal system, and so on, legal system, aspirations of the people, and they are not going to once again be as dominantly economic in the world. So with these few words, let me thank you very much, Dr. Nagappa and Mr. Malhotra, for inviting me here. And since I've not had too much time to prepare, I've been as spontaneous as I could possibly be. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Ranganathan, for the keynote address. The floor is now open for discussion.
Ambassador Ranganathan has always been a source of education and inspiration and enlightenment to many of us. You have given a very comprehensive and very focused keynote, and I fully agree with you. There's just one point which I wish to throw on table, and that's actually incidental to what your main thrust has been, and that's the concept of Indo-Pacific. I sometimes get puzzled when Indo-Pacific authorship is handed over to the Americans or to the Japanese. It is not. It is a typically Indian concept. And I am surprised that the Ministry of External Affairs and many of its stalwarts fight shy in endorsing this concept. I have a quotation from Nehru with me right now, which I can read out if needed be, in which he almost owned the Indo-Pacific and used the word which I think Ambassador Ponappa used somewhere else, pivot, which the Americans are very proud of, or partly confused also. But this is in the Indian culture. Before Nehru in 44, in 1941, there was a book by Kalidas Nag titled India and Pacific. Of course, it is based on cultural concept, which has now acquired strategic connotations. And I see no hesitation, no problem in adopting this concept to the limited extent where Asia-Pacific term is being used, which is the convergence of the Pacific and the Indian Oceans. And I see absolutely no reason why we are shying away from this concept. Thank you.
I think just carrying forward Professor Muni's point, I think what Ambassador Ranganathan has done is really to stretch the ambit of our discussion somewhat further than the American perception of Asia Pacific to the Pacific seaboard type of theater. The debate on Indo-Pacific, I think, has just begun. My research on it indicates that the specific term emerged out of a paper done by somebody at IDSA some decades ago. I'm subject to correction, as always.
2007, yes.
I think it was a little earlier. But the idea has got people started, and I do believe that Ambassador Ranganathan's survey of the state of play in Asia, including what is happening in Western Asia. I don't say West Asia because it sometimes tends to be thought of as in a box, but the whole area of Western Asia and the huge forces that are developing there would really serve to widen the scope of our discussion. Likewise, what's happening in Central Asia and why, given China's external relations with the huge number of neighbors that it has, you cannot really restrict the discourse to one part of Asia or the other. And let us remember that at one point Asia was defined as stopping at the borders of Myanmar. So we're talking about mindsets as well. And this is something that I think we could look forward to discussing as we go forward, including my own deep concerns about the fact that South Asia is actually a somewhat aberrant term. But that is for further sessions. Thank you.
1943, the World War II was ravaging on and the bombs were exploding and the guns were barking. Pandit Nehru was writing his pigeon diary in 1943. And he used the term Asia Pacific, saying that being confident that India would become independent and independent India is destined to play an important role in the Asia Pacific. Now, who fathered the term is the Indo-Pacific now is not very important. But what is important in my view is we should be evolving our own concept of Indo-Pacific in the changed circumstances of world politics. Our Defense Minister, Antony, has used the term Indo-Pacific. Our Prime Minister went to Japan and used the term India-Pacific. The Americans, when they say Indo-Pacific, they have a different notion altogether. So I think it is better that we evolve a concept of Indo-Pacific.
Well, I tend to agree with everybody, and I'm very grateful to Ambassador Leela Ponnappa for agreeing with me that we just cannot ignore expanding the ambit of our own interests. And this includes certainly what is happening in the Gulf and West Asia, particularly Syria, and its future consequences on India. Therefore, the whole canvas has to be expanded right up to from West Asia to the Pacific. This is the only observation I need to make. I mean, the origin of Indo-Pacific, Asia-Pacific is important because it was thought of even by our founding fathers. But more than noting that, we can go ahead with looking at Indian interests in each of these different geographical regions. Thank you.
Firstly, I'm just about to praise you. No, I want to thank Ambassador Ranganathan for a very lucid keynote address. And I also want to thank him for placing geography in the perspective that China is using it as. In fact, it was at the turn of the last century that Alfred Mackinder, it was also a fashionable thing to say that the only history that matters is the history of the Mediterranean. The only peoples that matter are the European people, and their arena is the geography of the world. We note that within a century, that particular statement, a very fashionable statement, belongs in the garbage pail, and I'd like to thank you for putting the geographic perspective, the geographic, should we say, dimension to growth, to economics, and indeed towards conflicts that may arise. Thank you, sir.
I now invite Dr. Arun Vishwanathan, Assistant Professor ISSSP, for the vote of thanks.
Good morning. Delivering the vote of thanks means that I take the added risk of standing between all the participants and tea. So I'll keep my remarks fairly short. Despite all the caveats that Ambassador Ranganathan added before embarking on his lecture, I am very glad that we got to hear you, sir, because your very erudite and very thought-provoking sort of remarks will provide a good food for thought for all of us. And I hope that during the course of the day, as we begin to think about the problems and the challenges which face us, and how do we strategize and respond to these challenges, your remarks will prove to be very useful, sir. Again, on the behalf of Director NIAS and all the members of the ISSSP, I thank each and every one of you for taking the time out and coming to Bangalore and joining us for the seminar. And lastly, a point of order is that we have organized a small sort of group photograph outside in the lawns. If you could all join us before tea for that. Thank you.